So this is my cabin that I record from most of the time in the woods. This is the reason why I need good fencing when I grow vegetables, when I grow food. And this is where we live, in the middle of a massive forest in Sweden, very much in the center of it. No neighbours, no human neighbours. Lots of deer and badgers and eagles and buzzards and plenty of moose, maybe some wolves, but no humans. They see a little bit more of the perspective. And there's the cabin. It's getting kind of engulfed by the forest. But I want to talk about food and how we produce food. This is one area of our food production. This is like a raised bed made by Fred Flintstone on the left, a little potato bed in the middle, and then some container beds on the right. And we have 4 different veg areas on our plot of land. That's the Flintstones raised bed made from rough tree trunks. And they're the containers. You can see there's some spinach in there and some carrots. This was taken 2 months ago or something. Some lettuce and potatoes coming up. It's next to a ditch, so it has pretty good drainage. This is a different, larger veg area right next to the house. It's kind of our market garden, if you like. It's where we come if we need food that you would get from a corner shop or from a little supermarket. We don't have anything like that, so this is where we come to pick veg. Most of this is they're carrots, but most of these are potato plants. And I like growing a lot of potatoes. That I find them really easy to grow here. They grow pretty fast and we get a good yield, and it's good in terms of calories, because if we were to get cut off as we live so isolated and we couldn't get food in a normal way, we could survive for, I don't know, 4 months, 6 months if we had to. It wouldn't be a lot of fun. It would be pretty bad, but we could survive fine. And the way we do this is that every year, especially from like end of April through to end of autumn, we grow all of our own vegetables, pretty much. Few things we buy, but most of it we grow. And we're outdoors people, so I eat a lot. My boy is growing fast. He eats a lot. My wife eats a lot, so we grow a decent amount of food. And this was taken a couple of weeks ago, me just by hand pulling up some potatoes. As you can see, they're beauties. They're absolutely delicious. If you pick a vegetable, whatever vegetable, and then you eat it an hour later, half an hour later, the sugars, the natural sugars in the vegetable haven't had time to turn to starch, which is what happens in a supermarket. The sugars turn to starch and the vegetable doesn't taste as amazing as it does when you grow it yourself. And these are just very cheap industrial kind of builders troughs. I always check that they're made out of the right kind of plastic, which is kind of food grade, so it will not, cause us to get some terrible disease further down the road. But they're cheap. They're really cheap, and they're not pretty. I don't really care how they look. I just want something that lasts year after year and is easy to grow in. And this growing like this is just so simple. I think pretty much anybody can do it. You don't even need tools. I use my hands. I like to get my hands in the earth, my hands in the soil. I'm a writer, so I'm writing all the time, and at a desk, indoors. So the amount of time I can get my hands in the earth and on rough wood, that's where I'm happy. So I'm digging around for these potatoes with my bare hands, and we dig up a couple of plants worth a day or something, and we have hundreds of plants going each season. And you can do a million things with potatoes. I was raised in the East Midlands on potatoes. I don't eat as many potatoes now as I did when I was young, but I prefer to eat a lot of meat and fish. But these are great, and when they're picked like this and eaten straight away, they're great. You can store them, you can dehydrate them, you can jar them, you can can them, you can freeze them if you want, but we eat all of our potatoes, pretty much all of them, when we pick them, because they taste that good. And we use some of them as well as seed potatoes to start for the next season. And then you're kind of getting into a more sustainable way of growing. If you grow carrots and then you let the carrot plants go to seed, and then you collect the seeds and you dry the seeds and you use those seeds, you've always got carrots. As long as you buy heirloom seeds, you've always got, we've gone sideways there. Yeah, there's another view of the potatoes. I plant 5 potatoes in each trough here. That's about the max I can get in there. You could maybe do 6, but I do 5. And the time to harvest a potato from a potato plant, you can start before the plants flower, well before the plants flower. Get really small ones, which are delicious, with a bit of salt and butter. And then you can go on and pick them whilst the plant is flowering. You can pick them after the plant has flowered and died back. And then you can even, look at that one, is this repeat footage? I'm not sure. But you can leave the potatoes in the soil, especially if the soil is well draining, which this is, as it's a container and I'm in total control of the drainage. You can leave the potatoes in the soil and they will do well for a long time. And then over winter, you can put them in like paper sacks and store them in a cool, dark room that's not too moist, and they'll last for ages and ages and ages. My granddad used to grow all of his own vegetables, all of his own food, and his potato sacks would last him through from one season to the next, from autumn all the way through to late spring when he was harvesting the first new potatoes again. So I was brought up with someone who was fairly self-sufficient when it comes to vegetables. He also had beehives and stuff and horses, so he had horse manure and grew a lot of fruit. But his vegetable patches were much better than mine, and his composting was better, and he was just a guy who spent an hour a day probably in his veg patches. This is this little market garden bit of our veg production area right next to the house. We've got like 3 or 4 different plots, which means it's easy to water. I do a lot of watering from a hand pump on a well because we live pretty much off grid. So watering takes a lot of time. It's a pain in the neck, and it's also very, very therapeutic and cathartic to go to a well and pump with your arm and drag watering cans around, those two, and throw off slugs and snails and work out if you've got any aphid problems and check in on your plants every day. I do enjoy that, and right now I'm recording this right at the end of June. It's so light up until like midnight, so I do this late at night when it's cooled down a little bit, and it's the end of my day. It's very refreshing. It's a way to clear my mind. Sometimes I do it with like a podcast on my phone, but normally I do it with nothing, and I just have a little think and check on my plants. So these, for example, they are white currants. That's lettuce. We've got white currants, black currants, red currants, gooseberries, raspberries in these containers, and they're doing really well. They've grown a lot since this footage was taken, which was just like 2 weeks ago. They are peas. They're flowering now. They're right up to the top of the canes. And these are all potato plants, which make up the bulk of my market garden space. So yeah, you get a lot of potatoes in one of these containers, in one of these troughs. I don't know how many troughs I've got, like 40 or something. And they're easy to take care of. I buy the trough, I wash it out, I drill drainage holes in the bottom, then I add a layer of gravel, and then I layer in the compost and the soil. They're carrots. Love growing carrots. There's nothing like a homegrown carrot. There's the peas, there's the lettuce, and that's the forest. So there's no border, there's no fence, there's no wall between me and the woods. It's just that. This is a fence that I made, DIY rubbish, made out of just like chicken wire and canes, but it does the job. It keeps the deer out, keeps the moose out, keeps my Saint Bernard out. And this is this massive granite rock, this glacial boulder that's bang in the middle of my homestead plot of land. Walking around here, this is honeysuckle, an enormous sprawling honeysuckle that smells incredible at night time. Over that wall there's a covered ditch, a ditch that I've covered with gravel and put a pipe in. On the left there are some early stage compost, like a 3-stage system. I like to make compost with all my old organic matter. And this is the other little, we call it the riverside, or my wife does, the riverside veg patch. Is next to a ditch. It's a bunch of old plant pots and old containers that we reused. There's a log pile over there in the forest, and potatoes in the ground, which do fine. They do pretty well actually, and then potatoes in this raised bed, which do better. I get a high yield from there. And this autumn I'm going to build some much bigger Flintstones style raised beds out of this felled pine. I've got a huge amount of pine that falls through storms, and I cut a lot of wood for firewood. That's how we heat our house. That's how we cook our food and heat our water, with free wood from the forest. So I'm always, throughout the year, especially when it's dry in spring, early summer, I'm cutting wood, I'm hauling wood, I'm stacking wood, and it comes in great to make very much free of charge raised beds. There's some potatoes, there's some carrots, there's some more potatoes and carrots, some peas, my hand. So I like it rough. I believe in perfect is the enemy of good, or perfect is the enemy of done. These potatoes are going to taste amazing. Those onions are going to be great. Those peas. I think there's spinach coming up in all of these now. More onions, more peas, more carrots. We've planted sweet corn and pak choy since this footage was taken like 3 weeks ago. And none of it's perfect. There are weeds around. My fencing isn't great. It doesn't matter. Like, nobody sees us here. Nobody sees this place apart from us, and all I really want is to do things really inexpensively that last and that produce delicious, healthy food for the family. So I don't care if it doesn't look perfect. Speaking of which, this is a very cheap and kind of bad solution. This is a hand pump well. I bought it off eBay. It was £35 or something like that. It took like 6 months to get to Sweden, but it pumps great, and I've had it for a year. It pumps water. I use it every night to water the garden. There's the earlier stage. There's some spinach and fresh rain. That is the beginning of the Flintstones bed. You can see me putting it together, trying to build walls out of leftover long timber, caning it all together, and then I use those canes to make the moose-proof fence afterwards. It works pretty well. Like I say, for some reason I like dragging logs around and cutting them up by hand if I can, with a handsaw or an axe. I just enjoy it. It's something about the smell of the wood and the feel of the wood. It makes me feel very connected to the landscape and to the forest. It sounds quite pretentious, but it's true. There's me filling up with soil, compressing it, treading it down, tidying up a little bit. No fence here yet. The fence is kind of essential because otherwise everything gets eaten. I mean everything. There's the canes up. My boy helped me tread down all of this compost, which was great. And then we put the seed potatoes in straight away. And we're harvesting from this bed now, and they've grown great. So a free of charge raised bed, decent size. I think I planted something like 40 potatoes in there, so 40 potato plants. On average, you get, 10 potatoes from each plant, so that's 400 potatoes from there in the first harvest, which is great. And then in a month, I'll plant something else in there in rows. And there's the forest backdrop. Yeah, and there's my hut, there's my cabin in the left-hand corner of the screen. On the right-hand corner is a prickly pear tree, a wild pear, that doesn't produce any fruit, unfortunately, really, but it's a good tree. It gives Bernie some shade in the middle of the day. There's the fence gone up, very simple again, but it keeps the wilderness out from eating all of our food. That's an early stage in that bed. These photos are very random. Again, early stage, a month ago maybe. In Sweden, it gets extremely sunny. May, June, July. So everything goes bananas and grows very, very fast. Once it gets going, it really gets going. There's some nice lettuce, kind of cut and come again. Take a leaf or one leaf from each plant, and never more than that, and then it'll just keep growing. Potatoes and an onion harvested. There you see it's getting a little bit more green. The berries on the far end. I've got 4 blackcurrant bushes in there, I think, and another 10 in the forest, planted in straight into the ground. I love currants. So for some reason, even though they're not protected by a fence, the deer leave them alone. Like, they nibble on them a bit, but they don't decimate them. Oh, there's Bernie and me on a midnight walk, almost midnight, like a 10:30 walk where it's still light. Potato plants coming up nicely. Like I said, this is a bit of a mess, right? I don't care if it's a bit of a mess. There's the pea flowers. Mess doesn't matter. I would rather it look a bit rough. These are berry bushes. They're black currants. But I love the idea of being reliant, being self-reliant, growing my own food, inspired by my granddad, and I think, and just a deep instinct to be okay if things were to go wrong here. And we're so cut off that it wouldn't take that much for us not to be able to go to the supermarket for quite a long time. This is some very bad watering. So I would have got this water out of the well via that cheapo hand pump thing, which I probably upgrade at some point, but to be honest, it works. I'm happy with it. It gets the water out of the well, and these potato plants are very happy to get a good drenching after a long Swedish summer day. I think these are a blight-resistant type. Most of the potatoes sold in Sweden are blight-resistant because it can get extremely wet here. And that also means we have huge infestations of slugs. Like every night even though I've got copper tape around most of the containers, which slugs hate. You can see the copper tape there against the wood.